The grey waters of Puget Sound stretched before Detective Sarah Chen like an accusation, each wave carrying whispers of the three young women who had walked into the morning mist 2 years ago and never returned. The small coastal town of Seaview, Washington, population 4,847, had learned to speak around their absence rather than of it, the way tongues navigate the tender socket of a missing tooth. Sarah stood at the edge of the harbour, October wind cutting through her jacket, understanding that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, but endured, like chronic pain that becomes part of your body's vocabulary. She had arrived from Seattle that morning, her transfer papers still crisp in her briefcase, carrying the official weight of the department's renewed interest in the case. But Sarah knew the real reason she was here had nothing to do with departmental priorities, and everything to do with the photograph in her wallet. Her cousin Amy, 16 years old, smiling at a birthday party 3 months before she became one of the vanished. The other two, Rebecca Walsh and Jennifer Martinez, had been Amy's closest friends. A trinity of youth that had seemed unbreakable until the morning they simply ceased to exist in any traceable form. The Seafarers Inn sat weathered and dignified on Harbour Street, its wooden facade bearing decades of salt and storm like badges of honour. Sarah checked in under the weight of the desk clerk's recognition. News travelled fast in Seaview, and a Chinese-American detective from the city investigating the town's deepest wound was news worth travelling. Mrs. Eleanor Hobbs, 73 years of perpetual observation, handed over the room key with eyes that had witnessed the town's transformation from fishing village to tourist destination to something more complex and indefinable. "You're Amy's family," Eleanor said, not a question but a statement of fact, worn smooth by repetition in her mind. "She used to come in here for my blueberry scones, always paid in exact change, always said thank you twice, like she was afraid once wasn't enough." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with these small revelations of Amy's life, details she'd never known, wouldn't have thought to ask about when asking was still possible. "Did you see her that morning? October 15th? Eleanor's face shifted, not into sadness, but into something more complex, a mixture of knowledge and resignation that Sarah recognized from 20 years of interviewing witnesses who knew more than they could articulate. "I saw all 3 of them. 6:30 in the morning, heading toward Deadman's Point. They were wearing their hiking clothes, had their backpacks. Nothing unusual except—" She paused, her fingers worrying the edge of her apron. "Except they weren't talking. Those girls were always chattering like birds, but that morning they walked in perfect silence." The silence Eleanor described seemed to expand in the small lobby, filling the space between them with unspoken implications. Sarah made a note in her tablet, her first of many, knowing that sometimes the absence of expected behavior was more significant than any action. Her room overlooked the harbour, and from the window she could see Deadman's Point jutting into the grey water like an accusatory finger. The name predated the girl's disappearance by a century, earned when a ship full of missionaries had foundered on the rocks in 1892, their bodies washing up for weeks afterward. Local legend held that on foggy mornings you could still hear hymns drifting across the water, though Sarah suspected this was more about the town's need for Gothic atmosphere than any supernatural occurrence. The knock on her door came as she was unpacking, sharp and deliberate. She opened it to find a man in his early 40s, tall and weathered in the way of those who spent their lives negotiating with the sea. His eyes held a wariness that seemed earned rather than natural, the kind that came from seeing too much and understanding too little. "Detective Chen? I'm Marcus Lindstrom. I was the one who led the initial search and rescue operation." His handshake was firm but brief, as if prolonged contact might transfer some unnamed burden. "I heard you'd arrived. Thought you might want to talk to someone who was there from the beginning." They walked to a small cafe on the waterfront, the afternoon light painting everything in shades of grey and silver. Marcus ordered black coffee with the automatic gesture of someone who'd given up on life's small pleasures, while Sarah chose tea, needing something to occupy her hands while her mind processed the information he was already beginning to share. "We searched for 6 weeks," Marcus said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of those weeks like sediment. "Had volunteers from 3 counties, dogs, helicopters, even brought in psychics when the families got desperate. Nothing, not a single trace. It was like they walked into the fog and became fog themselves." "The trail ended at Deadman's Point?" Marcus nodded, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table that might have been maps of areas searched, or might have been nothing at all. Their footprints went right to the edge, 3 sets side by side. The grass was still damp from the morning dew. We could see exactly where they'd stood, but after that, he spread his hands in a gesture of defeat. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no evidence they'd jumped or fallen. The tide was out that morning, so if they'd gone into the water, we would have found something on the rocks below. Sarah pulled out her tablet, showing him the case file she'd studied on the drive from Seattle. "The report mentions personal items found at the scene." 3 cell phones," Marcus confirmed, "placed in a neat row on a flat rock, like they'd been arranged for a photograph. All powered off. Their backpacks were 20 feet away, also arranged carefully, each one opened with the contents laid out. Water bottles, sandwiches, Amy's journal, Rebecca's camera, Jennifer's art supplies. Everything pristine, untouched, like they'd been setting up for a picnic they never attended. The detail about Amy's journal sent a spike of pain through Sarah's chest. Her aunt had mentioned it in their few, anguished conversations after the disappearance. Amy had written in it daily since she was 12, documenting her thoughts with the dedication of someone preparing for a future biography. The police had returned it to the family after analysis revealed nothing but the ordinary concerns of a 16-year-old, anxiety about college applications, excitement about a school play, a crush on someone identified only as M. "Was there anything unusual in the weeks before they disappeared?" Sarah asked, though she'd read the reports, interviewed the families, knew the official answer. But sometimes the official answer and the truth occupied different spaces, and the gap between them was where real investigation happened. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the harbour where fishing boats were returning with the day's catch, their horns announcing their survival of another negotiation with the deep. "There was something," he said finally, his voice dropping as if the walls might be listening. All 3 families mentioned the same thing independently. In the 2 weeks before they vanished, the girls had become different, not rebellious or troubled, just distant, like they were listening to something only they could hear. Sarah felt the investigation shifting beneath her feet, moving from the solid ground of procedure into something more uncertain. Did anyone investigate that angle? "How do you investigate a feeling?" Marcus asked, and there was genuine frustration in his voice. "How do you put in a report that 3 teenagers seemed to be sharing a secret they couldn't or wouldn't articulate? The department wanted facts, evidence, leads, not—" He gestured vaguely at the air between them. "Intuition about collective behavior." The sun was setting now, painting the water in shades of orange and red that looked almost violent against the grey sky. Sarah thought about Amy, about the last time they'd spoken. A brief phone call 3 days before the disappearance, where Amy had seemed distracted, her responses delayed, as if she was translating from another language. "There's someone else you should talk to," Marcus said suddenly, as if making a decision he'd been weighing since he'd knocked on her door. "Thomas Reeves. He's what you might call our local historian, though that doesn't quite capture it. He knows things about this town that aren't written down anywhere, stories that get passed down outside of official channels." He wrote down an address on a napkin, his handwriting careful and deliberate. "He lives up on Cliff Road, the old Victorian at the end. He doesn't much care for visitors, but if you mention my name and tell him it's about the girls, he'll see you." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Don't go after dark. Not because of him, but the road. It's treacherous without proper light, and too many people have had accidents trying to navigate it at night. As Sarah walked back to the inn, the town around her was settling into evening routines, porch lights coming on, families gathering for dinner, the ordinary rituals that marked Seaview as a place where people still believed in community and continuity. But underneath that normalcy, she could feel something else, a current of unspoken knowledge that connected the residents like an underground river, invisible but undeniably present. In her room, she spread out the case files on the bed, creating her own map of absence. 3 young women, bright and promising, who had walked to a place named for death and found something there that had claimed them without violence, without struggle, without explanation. Their families had been left with questions that hardened into wounds. Their friends with survivors' guilt that twisted into various forms of self-destruction or desperate normalcy. Tomorrow, she would visit Thomas Reeves and begin the real investigation. Not into what had happened, but into what Seaview knew and had chosen not to say. Every town had its secrets, but some secrets were different from others. Some secrets were agreements, collective decisions to look away from truths too large or too terrible to acknowledge. As she lay in bed listening to the harbour sounds, water against wood, wind through masts, the occasional cry of a seagull that had missed the memo about nightfall, Sarah thought about Amy's journal, about the careful documentation of a life that had been preparing for a future it would never reach. Somewhere in that prose was a key, she was certain, not to where Amy had gone, but to why she had chosen to go. The investigation had officially begun, but Sarah understood that what she was really investigating wasn't a disappearance, but a transformation. Not a crime, but a choice that 3 young women had made in perfect synchronization, walking hand in hand into something that Seaview had learned to live with but never speak about. And tomorrow, she would begin to understand why. Thomas Reeves's Victorian house perched on Cliff Road like a watchtower overlooking Seaview's collective unconscious, its gingerbread trim and weather vane fighting a slow, dignified battle against decades of coastal weather. Sarah drove up the winding road in the morning mist, her rental car's headlights barely penetrating the grey that seemed less like weather and more like the town's natural state of being. The house materialized from the fog gradually, as if deciding whether to exist or remain a rumor. The man who answered the door was not what Sarah had expected. Thomas Reeves was perhaps 60, with the kind of austere handsomeness that suggested academic corridors rather than small-town mysteries. His eyes, sharp and blue behind wire-rimmed glasses, assessed her with an intelligence that seemed to catalogue and file her presence in some vast internal library. "Detective Chen," he said, not a question, but an acknowledgement of inevitability. "Marcus called. Please come in. I've made coffee, though I suspect you might prefer tea." The interior of the house was a careful balance between museum and lived-in space, with Native American artifacts displayed alongside maritime antiques and walls lined with books that seemed to span centuries of human thought. Thomas led her to a study that overlooked the bay, where Deadman's Point was just visible through the morning haze, a dark finger of land pointing toward questions without answers. "You're not the first investigator to come here about the girls," Thomas said, settling into a leather chair that had molded itself to his form through years of use. "But you're the first with a personal connection, which means you might actually be willing to hear what others couldn't." Sarah accepted the tea he offered, Earl Grey, perfectly steeped, and waited. In her experience, people like Thomas Reeves couldn't be rushed. They dispensed information according to their own internal logic, like libraries that only opened certain sections to qualified researchers. "Seaview has always been a threshold place," Thomas began, his voice taking on the quality of someone reading from an ancient text. "The Quileute people who lived here for thousands of years before European settlement had a word for it that doesn't quite translate. The closest approximation would be where the world grows thin." They believed certain locations were points where different aspects of reality pressed close together, where transformation was not just possible, but inevitable. "You're talking about indigenous mythology," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to offend, but needing to establish boundaries between folklore and investigation. Thomas smiled, the expression both sad and knowing. "I'm talking about observed phenomena that predates our current understanding of reality. The Quileute kept oral histories of people who walked into the mist at Dead Man's Point and returned fundamentally changed. Not physically, but in some essential way that made them both more and less than human. The missionaries in 1892 weren't the first to disappear there, detective. They were simply the first to be documented in Western records." He stood and moved to a bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound journal that looked old enough to belong in a climate-controlled archive. "This was written by my great-great-grandfather, one of the town's founders, August 12th, 1901. He opened to a marked page and read, "The Hendricks girl returned today after 3 days' absence. She claims no memory of her time away, but there is something altered in her aspect that disturbs all who encounter her. She speaks of hearing colors and seeing sounds, of understanding the language of the tide. Her family has sent her to relatives in California, believing the sea air has affected her mind." Sarah made notes, her detective's training warring with the implications of what she was hearing. "Are you suggesting Amy and her friends experienced something similar?" "I'm suggesting," Thomas said, returning the journal to its place with reverent care, "that Seaview has always been a place where certain sensitive individuals experience reality differently. The town has learned to live with this, to incorporate it into our collective understanding without explicitly acknowledging it. It's why missing persons cases here have a different quality than elsewhere. People don't just disappear in Seaview, they transform." The morning sun had broken through the mist, casting long shadows across the study. Sarah thought of Amy's journal, of the entries her aunt had shared with her, searching for clues. There had been mentions of dreams that felt more real than waking, of hearing music that seemed to come from the earth itself, of feeling pulled towards something she couldn't name. 2 weeks before they disappeared, Sarah said, all 3 girls exhibited behavioral changes. Their families described them as distant, preoccupied. "You're saying this was, what? Some kind of calling?" Thomas poured himself more coffee, the gesture buying time while he seemed to weigh how much truth Sarah could accept. "Have you ever watched a murmuration of starlings, detective? Thousands of birds, moving as one entity, turning and flowing in perfect synchronization without any apparent communication. Science tells us it's about simple rules. Stay close, avoid collision, match average heading. But what if human consciousness, under certain conditions, could achieve something similar?" He moved to his desk, pulling out a file that looked more modern than the rest of the room's contents. "I've been documenting patterns for 40 years. Every generation, Seaview loses people to Deadman's Point. Always young people, always in groups of 3, always during periods of specific atmospheric conditions, low-pressure systems, electromagnetic anomalies, unusual tidal patterns. They don't die, Detective Chen, they transition." "Transition to what?" Sarah asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "To something our language doesn't have words for. The closest I can come is that they become part of the mechanism of the place itself. They join what the Quileute called the eternal watching, though even that is a poor translation." Sarah felt the investigation fragmenting, moving from the solid ground of police work into something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the fog, unable to see the bottom or even be certain there was one. "Their families deserve answers, Mr. Reeves. Concrete, understandable answers. Sometimes the truth and what people can understand are mutually exclusive," Thomas replied gently. "But I can give you something concrete. The night before the girls disappeared, there was an unusual electromagnetic event. The aurora borealis was visible here, which happens perhaps once a decade. Local electronics malfunctioned, phones, computers, even car engines. And three girls, all sensitive, all at transitional ages, all close friends, felt the pull of something beyond ordinary human experience. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at Deadman's Point. They're still there, Detective. Not their bodies, but their essence, their consciousness integrated into something larger. On certain nights, when conditions are right, people report seeing lights moving along the cliff face. 3 lights, always together, always in perfect synchronization. Sarah joined him at the window, looking at the point where her cousin had last stood in the physical world. You're asking me to believe in something that can't be proven, can't be prosecuted, can't even be properly described. I'm asking you to consider that not all mysteries are crimes, and not all disappearances are tragedies. The girls made a choice, Detective Chen. Not a conscious choice, perhaps, but a response to something that called to the deepest part of their being. They walked into transformation willingly, together, supporting each other through a transition that humans aren't supposed to be able to make. The room fell silent, except for the sound of wind against windows and the distant cry of seabirds. Sarah thought about the neat arrangement of the girls' belongings, the ceremonial quality of it, like an offering or a farewell. She thought about their silent walk that final morning, 3 friends moving in perfect unity towards something only they could perceive. There's someone else you should talk to, Thomas said finally. Emma Walsh, Rebecca's older sister. She's had experiences since the disappearance that might help you understand. She works at the Marine Research Station at the north end of town. She won't talk to reporters or police, but she might talk to Amy's family. Oh, as Sarah prepared to leave, Thomas handed her a small device that looked like a modified radio. This picks up electromagnetic frequencies outside the normal range. Take it to Deadman's Point tonight, around midnight. You won't find your cousin's body, Detective, but you might find something that helps you understand what she became. Driving down from Cliff Road, Sarah felt the weight of impossibility settling on her shoulders like fog. She had come to Seaview looking for answers that would fit into a police report, that would give Amy's parents closure, that would make sense within the framework of law and evidence and rational explanation. Instead, she was being asked to consider that her cousin had undergone a transformation that existed outside the boundaries of normal human experience. The Marine Research Station was a cluster of buildings that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts over decades of necessity. Emma Walsh was in the touch tank area, teaching a group of school children about sea anemones. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested depths held in careful check. When she saw Sarah, something flickered across her face, not surprise but recognition, as if she'd been expecting this moment for 2 years. After the children left, Emma led Sarah to a small office overlooking the harbor. The walls were covered with charts and graphs, tracking tidal patterns and water temperatures with obsessive detail. "You're here about Rebecca," Emma said. Not a question, but a statement of understood purpose. "About all of them, but Rebecca was my sister, so that's the part I can speak to." Sarah nodded, waiting, understanding that Emma, like Thomas Reeves, would tell this story in her own way. "The morning they disappeared, I had a dream," Emma began, her voice steady, but her hands clasped tight enough to whiten her knuckles. "I dreamed I was underwater, but breathing normally. Rebecca was there, along with Amy and Jennifer. They were singing, but the song was made of colors, not sounds. Rebecca looked at me and said, 'We're going to become the bridge, Emma. Someone has to be the bridge.' When I woke up, I knew they were gone before anyone reported them missing." She stood and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder thick with papers. "Since then, I've been documenting everything. Unusual tidal patterns that spell out messages in foam. Bioluminescent displays that shouldn't occur in these waters but do, always in groups of 3. Migration patterns of local species that have shifted to create corridors pointing to Deadman's Point." Sarah examined the documents, seeing in them the desperate attempt to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in loss. But there was something else too, a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence, too consistent to be imagination. "Last month," Emma continued, "I was doing a night dive near the point. The water was unusually warm, and there was this presence, not threatening, but aware. I felt Rebecca there, not as she was, but as she'd become. She was trying to communicate, but it was like trying to understand a language made of feelings rather than words." The office fell silent as both women sat with the weight of impossible testimony. Finally, Emma spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not dead, Detective Chen. They're transformed. And I think they're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Emma met her eyes, and Sarah saw there a mixture of fear and hope that seemed to encompass the entire human experience. For others to join them, for enough consciousness to accumulate to complete whatever transformation they began. Seaview has always been a threshold, but thresholds are meant to be crossed. The question is whether humanity is ready for what's on the other side. The electromagnetic detector Thomas Reeves had given Sarah clicked and hummed in her jacket pocket as she walked toward Deadman's Point at 11:47 p.m., the device's frequency increasing with each step, like a mechanical heartbeat, accelerating toward some inevitable climax. The moon was new, leaving only starlight to navigate by, and the October wind carried salt and something else, a smell like ozone before a storm, though the weather forecast had promised clear skies. She wasn't alone. Marcus Lindstrom had insisted on accompanying her, his search and rescue experience a practical counterweight to the increasingly impractical direction her investigation had taken. They walked in silence along the coastal trail, their flashlights creating pools of clarity in an ocean of darkness. "I've been here at night before," Marcus said quietly as they approached the point, "during the initial search. But this feels different. The air itself feels different." Sarah understood what he meant. There was a density to the atmosphere, a presence that seemed to press against them from all sides. The electromagnetic detector's clicks had merged into a steady hum, the frequency too high to properly register as sound, but felt as a vibration in her bones. They reached the flat rock where the girls' phones had been found, and Sarah pulled out the device. Its small screen showed wavelengths she didn't understand, patterns that seemed almost linguistic in their complexity. As she watched, the patterns began to shift, organizing themselves into something that looked deliberately structured, like text in an unknown language. "Look," Marcus whispered, pointing toward the cliff edge. 3 lights had appeared, soft and blue-white, moving in slow spirals along the rock face. They weren't reflections or any kind of phosphorescence Sarah recognized from her research. They moved with purpose, with what could only be described as intention, tracing patterns in the air that left brief after-images on her retinas. The electromagnetic detector suddenly went silent, and in that silence, Sarah heard something else, a sound like singing, but not quite, more like the memory of singing, or the idea of it. She thought of Emma's dream, of songs made of colors, and wondered if this was what transformation sounded like. "Detective Chen," a voice said from behind them, and both Sarah and Marcus spun around, hands reaching for weapons. But it was only Emma Walsh, though "only" seemed the wrong word for someone whose presence felt suddenly larger than her physical form should allow. She was wearing a wetsuit, her hair still damp, and her eyes reflected the blue lights in a way that seemed impossible given the angle. "You're here," she said, and it wasn't clear if she meant it as observation or invitation. "They knew you would come. Amy, especially. She's been trying to communicate with you, but the translation is difficult." Sarah felt reality tilting, her detective's training warring with the evidence of her senses. "Emma, what's happening here?" Emma moved past them to stand at the cliff edge, her body swaying slightly as if responding to music only she could hear. "Every culture has stories of transformation, Detective, metamorphosis, evolution. We accept that caterpillars dissolve completely to become butterflies, that tadpoles breathe water then air. Why is it so hard to believe humans might have their own metamorphic potential? The three lights had moved closer, hovering now just beyond the cliff edge, and Sarah could feel them. Not see, not hear, but feel them as distinct presences. One felt like Amy, not in any way she could articulate, but in the same way she would recognize her cousin's laugh in a crowded room or her handwriting on an envelope. They didn't die, Emma continued, her voice taking on a quality that seemed to harmonize with the humming Sarah could feel more than hear. They discovered what Seaview has always known but never acknowledged, that consciousness isn't confined to flesh, that awareness can exist in forms we don't have words for. Marcus had pulled out his own phone, trying to record what they were seeing, but the screen showed only static. "This is impossible," he said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "The indigenous peoples knew," Emma said. "They had ceremonies here, rituals designed to help chosen individuals make the transition, but colonization destroyed that knowledge, left only fragments and warnings. The girls rediscovered it instinctively, three minds synchronizing in a way that opened a door that's been trying to open for generations." The electromagnetic detector in Sarah's pocket suddenly spoke, not in clicks or hums, but in words, tinny and distorted, but unmistakably Amy's voice. "Sarah, it's beautiful. Here, don't mourn. We chose." Sarah grabbed the device, staring at its screen, which now showed waveforms that pulsed in time with the words. "Amy? Amy, can you hear me?" The response came not through the device, but through the air itself, a whisper that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. "We are the bridge. Others will follow when ready." Emma had begun to glow, not metaphorically but literally, a soft phosphorescence emanating from her skin. "It's starting," she said, her voice now clearly coming from multiple directions at once. "I've been preparing for 2 years, learning to exist in both states. Tonight, with your presence, with your belief, the circuit completes." Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back from the cliff edge. "We need to leave. Now. Whatever this is, we're not equipped." But Sarah stood firm, her eyes fixed on the lights that she now understood were her cousin, were all three girls, existing in a form that defied every category she'd been trained to recognize. "No, I need to understand. I need to know they're okay." Emma laughed, the sound like wind chimes made of light. "Okay is such a limited concept, Detective. They're more than okay. They're expanded, connected to everything, the tides, the migrations, the electromagnetic patterns that guide birds across continents. They experience existence in dimensions we can barely imagine." The lights began to move in more complex patterns, and Sarah realized they were trying to show her something, creating shapes in the air that almost resolved into meaning before dissolving. She thought of Amy's journal, her cousin's meticulous documentation of daily life, and understood that this was the same impulse, to record, to communicate, to leave evidence of existence. "But their families," Sarah said, surprised to find tears on her face. "Their parents, their friends, everyone who loved them. They're left with nothing but absence." "Not absence," Emma corrected, her form now flickering between solid and translucent. "Transformation, and not goodbye. Invitation. Every generation, Seaview produces those who can make the transition. Some go fully, like Rebecca and Amy and Jennifer. Others, like me, learn to exist in both states, to be the bridge they spoke of." She extended her hand to Sarah, and for a moment, Sarah could see through it to the stars beyond. "You have the sensitivity, Detective. It's why you became an investigator. You've always been able to perceive what others miss, to sense patterns below the surface. You could learn to do what I do, to be both human and more." The temptation was real and immediate. To understand fully, to reconnect with Amy, to transcend the limitations of flesh and thought. Sarah felt herself leaning forward, felt the pull of transformation like gravity, but Marcus's hand on her shoulder anchored her to the physical world. "Sarah," Think about why you came here, not to join them, but to find answers for those left behind. The spell, if that's what it was, broke, and Sarah stepped back from the edge. The lights that were the girls pulsed once, brightly, and she felt a wave of emotion that could only be described as understanding, perhaps even approval. Emma's form solidified again, though she maintained that subtle phosphorescence. You're right, both of you. Not everyone is meant to transform, and someone needs to remain to tell the story, to prepare others, to be the bridge between worlds. She reached into a waterproof pouch at her waist and pulled out a journal, Rebecca's journal, from the evidence that had been returned to the family. I've been adding to it, documenting what I've learned, what they've shown me. Take it. Use it. Help the families understand that their daughters didn't die. They evolved. They became part of something larger and more beautiful than individual existence. Sarah took the journal, feeling its weight as both evidence and responsibility. The lights began to retreat, moving back along the cliff face, but before they disappeared entirely, they formed a pattern that Sarah recognized. 3 interlocking circles, the symbol Amy used to sign her art, representing her and her 2 best friends, eternal and unbroken. As they walked back to town, the electromagnetic detector silent now in Sarah's pocket, Marcus finally spoke. What do we tell people? How do we report this? Sarah thought of the official report she would write, full of inconclusive findings and unexplained phenomena. Then she thought of the other report, the one she would share with Amy's parents, with the other families, carefully crafted to provide comfort without requiring belief in the impossible. We tell them the truth, she said finally, that the girls made a choice together, that they're together still, that they're not suffering. We tell them that Seaview has mysteries that can't be solved by conventional investigation, but that absence of explanation doesn't mean absence of meaning. They reached the parking area as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. Emma had remained at the point, saying she needed to complete something with the sunrise, and Sarah hadn't asked what. Some knowledge she was learning was earned rather than given. Will you stay? Marcus asked as they stood by their cars. Continue the investigation. Sarah looked back toward Deadman's Point, now just a shadow against the lightening sky. The investigation is over, but the documentation, that's just beginning. Someone needs to record what's happening here, to prepare for the next time, to help the next families understand. Emma can't do it alone. She's too far into the transformation to fully connect with ordinary human experience anymore. Marcus nodded slowly. The town needs someone who can stand at the threshold without crossing it, someone who can translate between worlds. As Sarah drove back to the inn, the journal beside her on the passenger seat, she thought about transformation and translation, about the courage it took to dissolve completely and the different courage required to remain solid, to be the witness, the recorder, the bridge. Her phone buzzed with a text from her aunt. Any news about Amy? Sarah pulled over to respond, crafting her words carefully. I found her. She's with her friends. They're together and at peace. I'll explain everything when I come home. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all the truth that could be carried in a text message, all the truth that could be believed without experiencing what she had experienced. The rest would take time, careful conversation, and perhaps a lifetime of translation between the world of the missing and the world of those left behind. 6 months after that night at Deadman's Point, Sarah Chen sat in her Seattle office, though office was perhaps too formal a word for the converted bedroom in her Queen Anne apartment that had become her center of operations. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and electromagnetic readings that created a constellation of connected disappearances spanning the Pacific Northwest. The journal Emma had given her lay open on her desk, its pages now supplemented with her own observations, creating a document that existed somewhere between scientific record and mystical text. The knock on her door came at precisely 2 p.m. as arranged. Dr. Helen Morrison stood in the hallway, her professional composure barely containing a desperation that Sarah had learned to recognize, the look of someone whose worldview had been shattered by an encounter with the impossible. "Detective Chen," Dr. Morrison began as Sarah led her inside. "Thank you for seeing me. I didn't know where else to turn. The police think I'm having a breakdown. My colleagues have suggested stress leave, but I know what I experienced was real." Sarah poured tea. She'd given up coffee entirely since Seaview, finding its sharpness incompatible with the softer frequencies she'd learned to perceive. "Tell me about your daughter, Dr. Morrison." Helen's hands trembled as she pulled out a photograph. "Melissa, 19, pre-med at UW. 3 weeks ago she went camping with 2 friends near Mount Rainier. They came back changed, not physically, but something fundamental is different. They speak in synchronicities, finish each other's sentences, and sometimes they're not entirely solid." Sarah studied the photograph, noting the quality of light in Melissa's eyes that she'd learned to recognize, the look of someone standing at the threshold. "Have they mentioned hearing or seeing things others can't?" "Constantly. They talk about patterns in the air, music in electromagnetic fields, messages in the migration of birds. The other parents want to have them committed, but I researched similar cases and found your name connected to several unexplained disappearances that weren't quite disappearances." Sarah moved to her wall of connections, pointing to various nodes in her expanding map. "Your daughter and her friends have begun a process of transformation. It's not mental illness or drug-induced psychosis. They're becoming sensitive to frequencies of reality that most humans can't perceive. The question is whether they'll complete the transformation or pull back from it." Helen's scientific training warred visibly with what she was hearing. That's not possible. Consciousness is generated by neural activity. It can't exist outside the brain. What if consciousness isn't generated by the brain, but merely focused by it? Sarah responded, pulling out a folder of electromagnetic readings. What if the brain is more like a radio receiver than a generator, and some people can tune to frequencies others can't reach? She spent the next 2 hours sharing what she'd learned, carefully calibrating the information to Helen's capacity to absorb it. She showed her the testimonies of families whose children had undergone similar transformations, the electromagnetic anomalies that preceded each event, the patterns that suggested something far more organized than random disappearance. "There's a choice to be made," Sarah explained. "Melissa and her friends can complete the transformation, moving fully into this new state of being, or they can be helped to remain grounded in consensus reality. But the window for that choice is limited. Based on my research, they have perhaps another week before the process becomes irreversible." Helen's composure finally cracked. "How is this happening? Why now? Why them?" Sarah moved to her window, looking out at the Seattle skyline, where thousands of lives intersected in patterns too complex for any individual to perceive. "Something is accelerating, Dr. Morrison. The incidents are increasing in frequency. What used to happen once a generation in places like Seaview is now happening monthly across the region. It's as if humanity is approaching some kind of threshold, and sensitive individuals are being called to cross it first." Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma, who now existed primarily in the transformed state, but could still sometimes manage text messages, though they often came through as poetry or mathematical equations rather than conventional language. "The pattern spreads, the bridge strengthens. Tonight, 7 will cross in Portland. The web grows bright." Sarah showed the message to Helen, who stared at it with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation with variables they'd never encountered. "This is really happening. Across the entire region. Across the world, actually," Sarah corrected, pulling up correspondence from researchers in Japan, Iceland, New Zealand, all documenting similar phenomena. But certain locations seem to be nodes, places where the boundary between states is thinner. "The Pacific Northwest is one of the strongest." Helen stood abruptly, pacing to the wall of connections. "You said there's a choice. How do I help my daughter make it? How do I even discuss something like this with her? Sarah joined her at the wall, pointing to a section dedicated to successful interventions. The key is not to deny their experience, but to anchor them to this reality through connection, purpose, and understanding. They need to feel that remaining human is a choice, not a failure to transform. I can work with them if you'd like. I've developed techniques based on what I learned in Seaview. Over the following days, Sarah worked with Melissa and her friends, teaching them to navigate between states without losing themselves to either. She introduced them to others who had pulled back from the edge, a network of individuals she'd been building who existed in a liminal space, aware of the transformation, but choosing to remain grounded. The breakthrough came on the fourth day. Melissa, sitting in Sarah's apartment surrounded by electromagnetic monitors and journals from other threshold walkers, suddenly solidified in a way that was visible even to her mother. "I can see both worlds," Melissa said, her voice carrying wonder rather than fear. "I can feel the pull of transformation, the promise of expanded consciousness, but I also see what I'd leave behind, not just family and friends, but the ability to help others navigate this change." Her friends made similar choices, though one, a quiet boy named Daniel, took longer to decide. "What if we're meant to evolve?" he asked. "What if staying human is holding back something important?" Sarah shared with him the words Amy had transmitted that night at Deadman's Point. "We are the bridge. Others will follow when ready." She helped him understand that readiness wasn't just individual, but collective, that humanity as a whole needed guides and translators, not just pioneers. A week later, Sarah received a call from Marcus in Seaview. "Emma's gone," he said simply, "fully transformed. She left a message for you." The message was a package containing years of observations, detailed instructions for detecting and managing transformation events, and a letter written in Emma's increasingly non-linear style. "Sarah, the bridge is built. You are its keeper now. What began with 3 has become thousands. The transformation isn't random, but responding to something approaching, something that requires human consciousness to evolve, or I cannot see the alternative clearly, but it feels like ending rather than beginning. Guide them. Some must cross, others must remain. The balance determines what humanity becomes. The girls send their love, translated through dimensions you'll one day understand." Sarah filed the letter with the others, the growing archive of a change that couldn't be stopped, only witnessed and perhaps guided. She thought of Amy, existing now in a state that transcended individual identity, part of something vast and interconnected that touched reality at points of transformation. That evening, Dr. Morrison called with gratitude and a request. "Melissa wants to study this phenomenon, to understand it scientifically. She's changing her major to consciousness studies, with a focus on electromagnetic effects on perception. She says you inspired her to be a bridge between worlds." Sarah smiled, remembering her own transformation from detective seeking missing persons to guardian of humanity's strangest threshold. "Tell her the bridge needs builders on both sides. We're documenting something unprecedented, possibly the next stage of human evolution, or perhaps something stranger, a branching where humanity splits into multiple forms of consciousness." Abrigi, as night fell over Seattle, Sarah stood at her window watching the city lights, each one representing a life that might, at any moment, begin to perceive beyond the narrow spectrum of ordinary reality. Her phone showed 17 new cases across 3 states, individuals and groups, beginning the transformation process. She thought of the families of the original 3 girls, how she'd carefully, over months, helped them understand that their daughters hadn't died, but had changed into something that couldn't return, but could still, in moments of alignment, transmit love across dimensional boundaries. It wasn't the closure they'd wanted, but it was a truth they could eventually accept. The work had become her life, part investigator, part counselor, part bridge between the transformed and the grounded. She'd given up her official detective position, funding her research through consultation with families experiencing similar phenomena and grants from organizations that operated at the edges of acceptable science. Some nights, when the electromagnetic conditions were right, she could feel Amy's presence, not as an individual, but as part of something larger, a consciousness that spanned dimensions and incorporated thousands of transformed beings. The message was always the same, translated through feelings rather than words. Continue, guide, balance, love. The phenomenon wasn't stopping. If anything, it was accelerating. Sarah's map showed exponential growth, clusters forming around specific geographic and electromagnetic nodes. Whatever was calling certain individuals to transform was becoming stronger, more insistent. But so was the network of those who chose to remain, to be bridges and guides and witnesses. They were developing protocols, support systems, ways to help people navigate the transformation without losing themselves entirely to it. They were learning that consciousness was far more flexible than anyone had imagined, that humanity might not be a fixed state, but a spectrum of possibilities. As Sarah prepared for bed, she made her final notes for the day in the journal that had begun with Amy's disappearance and had become a testament to humanity's strangest evolution. Day 180. 17 new cases identified. 3 successful interventions, 2 complete transformations, 12 still in process. The pattern continues to accelerate. We are witnessing either the end of humanity as we know it, or its multiplication into forms we're only beginning to understand. Amy was right. They are the bridge, but we are the architects of what crosses it. Outside, Seattle hummed with its usual energy, unaware that within its boundaries, consciousness was learning to exist in new forms, that some of its citizens were becoming something beyond human, while others learned to stand at the threshold and translate between worlds. The investigation that had begun with 3 missing girls had become something else entirely, a documentation of humanity's strangest hour, when evolution knocked at the door, not with violence, but with invitation. And those who answered found themselves part of a transformation that would either elevate the species or divide it forever. Sarah turned off the lights, but the electromagnetic monitors continued their vigil, clicking and humming with frequencies that suggested the night was far from quiet. Somewhere, someone was beginning to transform. Somewhere else, someone was choosing to remain. And in between, bridges were being built from consciousness itself, spanning the gap between what humanity had been and what it was becoming.